Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another edition of the Travel Royally podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have as our guest Mr. Stephen Proctor. Now, if you don't know who Stephen is, he's been a writer his whole life, and the two books that he's written are simply remarkable. He served as a senior editor at the Baltimore Sun, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Houston Chronicle. He's a native of Maryland, and he attended and graduated from the American University in Washington, D.C. And later in life, he was awarded a journalism fellowship at Stanford University. Fortunately for us, he's an avid golfer, spent the last decade studying the history of our favorite game. And his first book was the award-winning Monarch of the Green, and his latest book is titled The Long Golden Afternoon. He'll have a new podcast coming out in the not too distant future called The Duffer's Literary Companion with our friend Jim Hartzell. Stephen, welcome to the Travel Royally podcast.
It is great to be here, Jeff. I appreciate you having me.
I'm glad that you're speaking loudly as the train goes by. Normally I would mute it while you're speaking, but I've got no control over that.
That's okay. I live right next to a train stop myself, so you may hear it soon enough you're over it from this end.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Stephen, you're known as a writer, so let's start there. What led you to want to become a writer in the first place?
Well, that's a great question, Jeff. I've always been a person that liked reading, and I think my mother noticed that. And very early, I think I might have been 13 or 12, my mother put a book in my Christmas stocking called Harvest Poems by Carl Sandburg, which I love that book so much. And I loved Carl Sandburg. And what I loved about his poetry was how musical it sounded when you read it out loud. And so that just started a lifelong love affair with words. I started becoming a complete poetry geek for like 3 years, wrote bad poetry, took pictures of myself in the forest with a navy pea coat and a long rust-colored scarf wrapped around me, looking romantically like a writer. So, I spent the rest of my life binge reading on whatever topic happened to be the topic of the moment for me then. It might be novels, might be chess, might be the history of thoroughbred horse racing or the history of golf. But it's always been the same, just read. So I've loved reading and writing my whole life. And I was desperate to try to figure out a way to get a job somewhere where I worked with words, and initially thought I would be a novelist or a poet, but it became pretty clear to me at the beginning that that wasn't going to happen. And so then I turned my attention to more practical things and ended up being a journalist, which was a wonderful career. And I was lucky enough during the course of that career to get pointed in the direction of literary journalism. One of my editors just noticed a failed poet in me, I feel sure, and pointed me in that direction. And that's what I did my fellowship in at Stanford, was short fiction, with the idea of being able to use those same techniques to write true narrative stories.
And this was later in life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Relatively speaking.
Yeah, no, I did not actually even play golf until now. I shouldn't say that. When I was a young kid, one of my best friends, his father played golf and he played golf, and we had one summer where we golfed together quite a bit at a local course near where I lived in Maryland called Glendale. And but I worked in a meat room as a like a butcher, and so I got a hernia hauling in a side of beef from the truck one day, and so then I couldn't play golf, and I never actually got back to it again because I soon after that started college, and I was really busy working on the college newspaper and other things. I never ever got back to golf, and when I was in my 40s. Just turning 40, my wife was encouraging me to play golf because so many of I had risen up by then to an executive level, and all the other executives played golf, and I mostly went to the racetrack. I love horse racing. I still do. And then my publisher, who was also a horse racing nut, showed up in my office one day with a set of golf clubs and announced that I was taking up golf. That we were going to start playing golf instead of going to the races, and that he'd arranged for me to have lessons and this and that. And oh, by the way, I owed him $150 for the clubs. So that's how I got started. And, like most people that play, you may have already observed, I have something of an addictive personality, and so I was a sitting duck for the game of golf, and I was very quickly addicted to it and to the stories of its history, which is just my natural inclination when I start a thing that I think I'm going to like a lot, is to start reading up on the history and just see how it got to be where it is. And that's something that hasn't stopped since then either, actually.
Well, you spent a long time in the newspaper business, obviously. What led you to write a book and now a second?
When I moved to San Francisco in 1993 and became one of the top editors there at the San Francisco Chronicle and eventually the managing editor. But it was pretty obvious to me, particularly there in California, that the newspaper game, the way I loved it, was not going to survive the internet. That it was not going to be possible to do the type of work that attracted me to journalism with anything like the level of depth and excellence that you had in the years that had preceded that. Mm. And so and also the more I got high up, the more I became the managing editor, I increasingly was in charge of cutting the budget and laying off the staff. And so for the last several years of my career, that was one of my principal occupations, was figuring out how to do as good a job of covering the community as was possible to do with a lot fewer people. And of course, that wasn't as much fun as, doing literary journalism and other sorts of things. So I decided that I should start thinking about a different kind of writing life if I couldn't last until I was 65 as a newspaper editor, which was already a concern even then. Yeah. And so I just started reading about the history of golf because I decided I'm going to do I don't know what, but I'm going to do golf history. So, me being me, I went and bought the Classics of Golf library, the first thing, the 69 volume library, because I knew that Herbert Warren Wind had selected those as the seminal works of golf. And I thought, there's a great place to start. Just read all of those and see where that takes you. And that's what I did.
Wow, that's fantastic. Back then, when you were working in newspapers, there were a lot of notable writers across all the various pages of a newspaper. I happened to live in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, and Jim Murray I couldn't wait to tear open the paper every morning and read Jim Murray.
No, he is such a brilliant man. My paper, the Baltimore Sun, was owned for many years by the Los Angeles Times, known as the Times Mirror Corporation. Right. And so I had a lot of interaction with the executives of the Los Angeles Times. I didn't ever get to meet Mr. Murray, but he was obviously highly regarded in the industry as one of the great sports columnists at that newspaper or any newspaper. And, in the days when newspapers were thriving, there was quite a lot of brilliant work done in them. And I was lucky, very, very lucky, to be part of some absolutely fabulous work, both of an investigative nature and of a storytelling nature. And it was an incredibly exciting and fulfilling job in those days. Yeah. And I would say, I have had a very, very lucky life. I have no complaints about my life of any kind, but among the few sadnesses of it was to watch the horrible decline and decimation of something that you had taken so much joy from, and you felt, I think, I still do feel, contributed quite a lot to the communities where I worked in terms of protecting their citizenry from fraudulent people and other sorts of things. And you felt proud of that. So it was tough watching that. But, I'm a turn the page person. So when I decided to turn the page, I did my last day in journalism in October of 2013. And the next morning, I wrote the first chapter of the book about young Tommy.
Excellent.
And I haven't I've not looked back at the newspapers I've managed. When I've left the papers I managed, I never read them again. I didn't want to spend my time agonizing over how I thought someone else was not doing it right, or whatever you must inevitably think when you look back at you were once in charge of. So, I'm a believer in turning the page, and I went into golf. I leaned into the golf writing thing heavily, and I've gotten a great deal of joy out of it, and a wonderful retirement life out of being the golf historian.
Yeah. I grew up in a city where we had two newspapers, a morning edition and an evening edition, right? I mean, that's how important. my family got both, right? I mean, my dad would
So
read
did
one in
mine.
the
We got
morning
the
and my
Washington
family
Post
got,
and the Washington Star. The same
yeah,
thing. Exactly. And I delivered both of them. I delivered the Post on my way to school and the Star on my way home.
wow.
And so I was a newspaper guy very early, and I love newspapers. The front of the house, my living room now, and has for many, many years been decorated with famous front pages from the history of the Baltimore Sun, which is my true love and always will be.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me, I seem to recall, I used to go to business to San Francisco quite a bit on business in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't the sports page of the Chronicle green on green
Yes,
paper.
yes, it was called the Sporting Green, for in the same way that a golf course was called a green in the ancient days.
Yeah,
So you played over the green, whatever it happened to be, whether it was a football green or a golf green or whatever. And the paper, the Chronicle has always been a really highly quirky paper, like the city that it serves. Papers always reflect the city they serve.
right.
So the feature section was pink, and the sports section was green. And in fact, the name of the feature section for some years, people in the town just referred to it as the pink. Did you see the pink today? And same thing with the sporting green. At one point, green paper is incredibly expensive and it doesn't reproduce images very well. And there's a lot of negatives about green paper. And at one point, the green paper was eliminated, as was the pink paper, and just crushed the paper. The town hated it so much. And so I was there in an age when the green paper was returned, and to much, much joy in the city. So yeah, it's a individual quirky little paper, the Chronicle.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's shift to your books. Let's talk about Monarch of the Green to start with, which is the story of golf's most dominant player. With all due respect to Tiger Woods, it's about young Tom Morris. How did that book come about? I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but
So I told you that I was binge reading books. One of the ones that I was reading was To the Lynx Land by Michael Bamberger, which Jim and I have both talked about quite a lot on our on that podcast we did with Randy, Big Randy on the Trap Draw, and Michael Wolff was there too. That book made me dying to go to Scotland. So I started figuring out, okay, I have to go and do a Scotland trip. So I started thinking about it. And of course, while I was doing research to figure out where I wanted to go, I come across Herbert Wynn's piece, North to the Links of Dornoch, from the New Yorker in 1964. So I decide, okay, so me and my friend, Lee Horwich, who edited this most recent book and came with me on that trip, he worked with me at the Sun. He's a great newspaper himself. I put us in the lottery for free tee times on the old course that September, with the idea that if we could get a tee time at St. Andrews the following July, from there we could build the trip. And so that, luckily for us, we were chosen, and we got a tee time on a Monday morning in July, mid-July. And I think the Open was in England that year, so it was maybe that's part of why we got. I've been in that lottery a bunch of times since, and I've never once succeeded other than the first time. So
yeah,
maybe it's meant to be. We got there on a Sunday and we went touring around St. Andrews. And one of the things that, besides walking the old course and watching everybody have a picnic and all the things that are going on the old course on a Sunday, which is just magical by itself, and something as an American seeing for the first time, you're like, it's just such an eye opener as to what a different game golf is in Scotland, and how it's like a birthright for Scottish citizens in a way that it never shall be in this country. But so that's just a huge eye opening day. And we, of course, then wandered up to the cathedral. And I knew about Old Tom and Young Tom in the way that most people know about Old Tom and Young Tom. You'd heard of them. You knew they were famous old golfers, and they won a bunch of Opens a long time ago. And but when I saw his monument, I was just intensely struck by that. It's like, I don't know how tall it is, 12 or 13 feet. It's quite towers above you. Tommy's nearly life-size in the carving of him standing over a putt. And there's a wonderful quote on it. But the thing that really got my attention as a writer and a storyteller was the inscription at the very bottom that said it was erected by 60 golfing societies. And so I dug into that a little bit that next couple of days there and realized that's all the golfing societies. That's every society. And, obviously I'm well enough versed in the history of the world to know that in Victorian Britain, it wasn't something rich people did on the regular was put up statues to working class people.
Right.
So it occurred to me that he must have had such an extraordinary life for all 60 golf clubs that existed to pitch in to build a monument to his memory. There's a reason that guys do that. All through history, people have done it. And the reason is they don't want anybody to forget what they lived through and what they witnessed. Right. They want history to remember this kid who was obviously so extraordinary. And so then that was the moment I said, all right, now I know what the story is. I'm going to do a story about young Tommy. And the more I looked into it, the more I really felt like part of the reason that no one knew as more about him than they did was that it's a pretty big shadow. The shadow is his father. His father lives so long and is so famous and does so much that I feel like part of it is, Tommy hadn't ever been considered outside the confines of his father, right. Considered independently as a golfer. And one of my main goals of that book was for it to be a book about Tommy. Obviously, it has to involve old Tom. I'm not saying that it can't involve old Tom, but the focus is on bringing Tommy out by himself, and let's look at Tommy and what he did for the game. And that was what I set out to do.
Well, you did it very well. The book is fantastic. I'd studied both old and young Tom. I've read books and accounts of what their exploits were. I've walked the town and seen where they lived, where their shop was, where old Tom's shop was. I actually stayed in a Airbnb in a town nearby called Darcy, where old Tom's wife was born.
Agnes.
In a farmhouse that was magnificent, by the way. But for those people who are unfamiliar, tell our listeners just how good a golfer young Tom was.
Young Tommy had a lifetime winning percentage. One of the things this is a nice story about my son. My son always reads my manuscripts for me because he's a wonderful critic. He doesn't golf much, but he's a great critic. And so he finished the Tommy book. He said, nice book and everything, but doesn't have any statistics. Sports fans like statistics. Haven't you figured out what his record is? And I said, no, I haven't figured out what his record is. That would be some undertaking. And he said, well, you ought to undertake it. So I did that. It took me another year and a half, actually, to go back and document every single occasion on which I could find that Tommy competed in a professional event for substantive money. And it's sometimes a little difficult to figure out exactly where that line is. But I settled on 99 events that he participated, some of them foursome matches for big money, some of them singles matches, some of them professional tournaments. His lifetime winning percentage across those events was 60%. No golfer in history gets even remotely close to that. Now, obviously, smaller fields, et cetera, et cetera. But Tommy put up scores that were otherworldly. No other way to describe them than that. In 1870, when he won the belt at Prestwick, Tommy went around in 149 strokes, which boggles the mind. And It was very, very interesting to me recently. And I feel like it reinforced the point that I tried to make in the Tommy book when Prestwick recreated the original 12-hole course. And they did it so lovingly and authentically that it was really quite like it was when Tommy played it. And a number of professionals went out and attempted to beat Tommy's opening score for the 12 holes of 47, and with modern clubs and modern balls, and 14 clubs instead of the 7 Tommy carried, and a modern 3-piece long distance ball instead of the rock hard gutty that he played with. And not many of them got close. So I find it really, really fascinating evidence there that how well Tommy actually holds up all these years later over essentially the same ground. And obviously Tommy had some advantages of playing it all the time and this and that, but my goodness, that was impressive.
Put those guys in a straitjacket of a suit and tie and street shoes and see how they play. right?
Yeah, two of them played as a scramble, a two-person scramble, wearing authentic period clothing. And so then they each had a shot, obviously. So they had, that's not the same as playing it yourself. But even they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
They got really, really close. I think they lost by one shot from the video I saw. But the one of the pros who's quite a famous YouTube character, Rick Shields, he shot 53, which doesn't beat any of Tommy's three scores that year in the Open. Tommy shot 47, 51, 51. So Tommy held up pretty well after all those years. And he was just an extraordinary player and a great putter. One of the first, really, what I would call, modern players, in the sense of he didn't have any use for maxims like "don't press." He just swung as hard as he could. Whenever he swung at the ball, consequences be damned. If it got in a bad spot, he actually got a kick out of that, and he got a kick out of the brilliance of his recovery. He was a lot like Seve Ballesteros in that way, in the sense of he knew no fear of any kind. And he always was 100% confident of ability to recover from whatever trouble happened to be the result of this slashing swing I'm right about to take.
Well, you mentioned the fact that he won nearly 60% of the tournaments he entered. And those included singles and four balls as well. I wonder what his record would have been if his father was a better putter.
A lot better in foursomes. I mean,
Yeah.
Harry Everard, who is one of the, a contemporary of a friend of old Tom, member of the Royal and Ancient. He wrote quite a lot for the local newspapers in those days. And he said that the old Tom was never more than a drag on his son. Now, I think that's actually a little tough on the old guy. He was a pretty formidable golfer himself, and, a person who had a wonderful temperament for the game, and, was not going to be a person who ever funked. He did have a terrible problem with short putts for an extended period of his life. His own son would say, "My father would be a great putter if the hole was a yard closer." And there's a guy that was a member at the Royal and Ancient who was a character named James Wolfe Murray, who I think he played his rounds on a white horse, and he had a caddy for the horse and a caddy for the clubs. In any case, he wrote a letter that was addressed to the Mister of Short Putts, Prestwick, Scotland, and it was delivered by the postman directly to Tom's door. So it was not unknown that Tom had trouble over the short ones.
Well, I'll tell you what, we talked about what a great golfer young Tom was. Old Tom was a wonderful golfer as well. And when he would have been playing in these matches, he would have been in his 40s, which by today's standards would have been quite old and probably less competitive than he would have been when he was younger, obviously. But I find it fascinating when you talk.
He was in his 50s in their final match in 1875. Tom, being born in 1821, was 54 when they beat the Parks at North Berwick on the day that Tommy's wife died. So, Tom was an older man. And the other thing is he had a million design projects going on. He was the keeper of the green at St. Andrews. Tommy only played golf. He didn't do other things.
He had a family to support as well, and family issues come up.
Right.
And
so, he had a shop and all that. So he had a lot of distractions. So we got to be fair to old Tom there.
Yeah. But what I found interesting, or a corollary perhaps, you talked about the 60 clubs, all 60 clubs, erecting a monument in young Tom's honor. When you think about it, the reason there's an Open Championship was because Alan Robertson died, and they needed to name the person who is the best golfer, right? Have you, from your research over time, is how good was Alan Robertson, and how good was he compared to young Tom?
He was a very different sort of player than young Tommy, in the sense that he played a type of golf the Scots call pawky. And pawky is a word that means cunning in wit or strategy. So Alan was more a maneuver your ball around the hazards type of a player. He also had a fondness for really light golf clubs, and he tended not to be as strong on a golf course that wasn't as pristinely kept as St. Andrews always was. And so, for instance, when in the great match of 1849 against the Duns of Musselburgh, Alan is really struggling because North Berwick, where the final round took place, was in those days the links that was either green or hazard. It wasn't a lot in between. And he wasn't as effective there. And somebody actually in the crowd shouted, "That wee body in the red jacket can't even play golf." So, he had his weaknesses. I don't think he would have been able to handle young Tommy. Old Tom himself said many times, "I could handle Alan, but never Tommy." And so I don't think he was as good a golfer as Tommy. He was incredibly dominant in his own age.
Right.
And he was, as far as I can tell, never beaten in a foursome match, especially none with Tom himself. And he was so dominant that there was a competition. One of the very first tournaments that was regularly held was something that was held at St. Andrews, where the members put up money for a competition among the caddies. They called it the inputs, in the sense of members put in money. And Alan got barred from that competition just to give someone else a chance to win. So there was a time when he deserved the reputation he had as the best golfer of his age. Although my own personal view is that when Willie Park came onto the scene in 1854, now Alan's only got 5 more years to live at that point. I believe Willie would have beaten him if Alan would have accepted his challenge, which Alan would not. Willie put an ad in the national newspaper challenging specifically Alan Robertson or Old Tom or anybody to a one-on-one match for £100 a side. And that's a lot of money. And Alan would not accept it because he felt that Willie needed to beat someone else before he took on the champion. So George Morris, Tom's brother, accepted, and Willie beat him so badly that George finally said, "For the love of God, man, just give me a half." And so it was not. And Tom decided to defend his brother's honor, and he too got beat pretty good by Willie. At his prime, right then in the 1850s, I think my own personal view of it is that Willie was the best player alive at that particular moment. He never got to demonstrate that one-on-one against Alan Robertson. Alan very justly didn't want to give up his crown lightly. And so that's what I think, for whatever it's worth.
Well, there was quite a rivalry between the golfers of Musselburgh, right, and the golfers from St. Andrews.
Yes, there was a sporting rivalry. They were friends. Willie Park and Tom fought each other, multiple times between 1854 and 1882, when they had their last match. Tom's quite an old man then. Willie's not in very great health. His health didn't hold up as long as Tom's. And but Willie always said, "I like it best when I play against Old Tom." And they were rivals, but it was a sporting rivalry, not a hostile rivalry, except among fans. Now, obviously, fans are different than players, and the fans of Musselburgh were very heated and often.
Well, there was a famous incident, wasn't it, at Musselburgh, where Old Tom walked off, dragged young Tom with him?
What happened was, in 1870, they had one of their great matches, and it got the crowd at Musselburgh, where one of the legs took place. It would be St. Andrews, Musselburgh, North Berwick, usually those three, or Prestwick you might add in for a fourth. Tom was from St. Andrews and Willie was from Musselburgh, so he always wanted neutral territory. And North Berwick very often functioned as neutral territory. In any case, at Musselburgh, the fans were Tom was winning, and that was nerve-wracking for them. They started crowding around him so badly that he couldn't take a shot. People were kicking his ball in the gorse bushes and things of this nature. And Robert Chambers, who was the Edinburgh Journal editor and a very famous golfer, was the referee of the match, and he halted the match. Tom did not walk off. This is really critically important. He halted the match because the crowd was too unruly to continue. What happened was they retired to the bar, which you naturally would do. They went to
Morgan's, wasn't it?
And in Mrs. Foreman's, Tom was sitting there drinking a black strap, which was his favorite drink, stout and soda. And Willie refused to accept the decision that the game was being halted. He went and played the final 6 holes. Finished them in 22, by the way, which is pretty incredible golf.
Yeah.
The judge, the Chambers had ordered that they return the following morning to let tempers cool and play out the final 6 holes. Tom came, he played out the 6 holes himself. He shot 26, by the way, not anywhere near as good as Willie's. And then Chambers awarded the tournament to Tom because he had followed what the referee said. Willie sued. It ended up in court. In the end, the match was nullified by the court, and it was determined inconclusive, and the stakes were returned. The way you did a big match then was there was a date by which you had to have your cash to the stakeholder. So a wealthy person, a trustworthy wealthy person would be holding the stake and have charge of the stake. So the stake was never distributed, kept even because Willie immediately disputed Tom being awarded the thing, and then the stakes were not distributed. In the end, the court had them return the stakes to the original backers, which would be not Willie and Tom, but whoever was gambling on them.
Right. Let me ask a question. What do you think about the comment that without old Tom as a golfer, there couldn't have been a young Tom golfer? In other words, without his dad's presence, and I don't mean just as a father, but as a golfer and a gentleman and so forth.
Well, I think there's probably a lot of truth in that, but it's also true that Tommy was a prodigy in a way that was probably not determined by his parent. You know, Tommy played in his first public match when he was 13. And if you could see the picture of him, which is on the back of that book, Monarch of the Green, look at his eyes and tell me you don't think that's a fierce competitor. Right. You know, he had true gifts. Obviously, being the son of young Tom gave him incredible advantages in the game, equipment, everything else. So that was huge, but I feel he would have made it one way or another. Excuse me.
Would you agree that old Tom has had a far greater impact on the game of golf overall than young Tom?
Yes. I don't think there's any disputing that. There is no person who has had a greater impact on the game of golf than old Tom Morris. And part of that is simply that old Tom Morris lives long enough to be a person who played with a feather ball and with the Haskell ball. And only old Tom lived that long. So he had this effect of bridging the generations of the game in a way that no one else was able to do. You know, young Tommy had a lot to do with the game becoming a spectator sport. And I would say he deserves the credit for it becoming a widely loved spectator sport, much more so than his father or Alan or anyone. But Tom is the person who helped to spread the game. He laid out golf courses, 75 golf courses all over Scotland and England. In the age when travel was not easy, he would get to very remote places like Dornoch and Ashkernish, which those would have been unbelievably grueling journeys, and make golf courses there. He also, you know, he was the font of wisdom in the game. So if you wanted a golf club professional for your club that you're just now starting in England or in the United States or in South America or in Australia, you were told to contact old Tom and he could recommend a man for you. And so not only did he recommend professionals all over the world, lay out golf courses, make clubs and balls, play championship golf, be the father of the greatest golfer the world had ever known. So yes, he is the greatest and most influential person in the history of the game, and I don't think it's close.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think the other thing that's interesting, there's a legacy, you know, with old Tom and people like Donald Ross.
Oh my gosh, yes. You know, Donald Ross was a young boy when Tom was brought out there to Dornoch, where many of your listeners may or may not know that Donald Ross was born and raised in Dornoch. And there are a number of historians who I've seen write that he actually followed Tom around when Tom was creating the original design of Dornoch. I don't know if that's not documentably true that I'm aware of, but it makes perfect sense that he was really interested in golf as a young man, like every young man growing up in Scotland is. And so he definitely was sent to be an apprentice with Tom for a while, also with Robert Forgan, and then returned to Dornoch and became the head professional at Dornoch before he moved to the United States in 1899 and began laying out golf courses here. So old Tom had tremendous influence over a lot of architects. A.W. Tillinghast, C.B. McDonald learned his golf from old Tom, played in foursomes with young Tommy when Tommy was at the absolute peak of his fame. And that experience obviously, had great influence over McDonald. I think the influence of old Tom is a lot more ubiquitous in the world of architecture than people believe.
Wow, I agree 100%. Let me ask one last question about that book, Monarch of the Green. You did a lot of research, obviously. What's the most surprising thing you learned in doing that research?
Oh boy, that's an excellent question. Well, I would say the most surprising thing is the astonishing winning percentage of young Tommy.
Yeah.
I mean,
Thanks to your son.
I used to think Bobby Jones was the greatest golfer of all time. And his winning percentage of major championships is something in the 30s, which was staggering to me.
Right.
But to see somebody win at the percentage that Tommy won, blows your mind. The other thing is the three. The three on the first hole at Prestwick in 1870. He opens that defense. He opens his campaign to win the belt by making a three on a 578-yard golf hole where 880 yards out from the tee, there's a swamp. You either need to go around, lay up short of, or carry. And nobody was going to carry that.
Right.
So, he had to have hit the third shot from 180 or 200 yards, which is a long way in those days, and holds it. So, those were some things that made you stand up and say, "Oh my gosh, what manner of player is this?" And it's pretty spectacular in my view.
Actually, I skipped a question that I now that I think about it. Young Tommy was a unique individual, not only as a golfer, but he was quite different from his contemporaries.
Yes,
right?
And this is something where you go back to the influence of his father, okay? Because his father was obviously enormously well connected to, because he was the lead partner in foursomes of some of the richest and most able men in Scotland. Those men, James Ogilvy Farley most likely, arranged for young Tommy to be accepted at the Ayr Academy, which is then and now one of the most prestigious schools in Scotland. So Tommy went to school beside the sons of the men that he would partner in foursomes on the weekends. And he was very highly educated, much more so than any of the men of his own class.
Yeah.
The only person who was a rival to him in education was his best friend, not surprisingly, Davy Strath, who worked initially as a law clerk and had also been educated beyond what most kids got. What old Tom got, what most people got was to go through basically through sixth grade and then leave school at the age of 12 and know how to read and write, mainly to read your Bible, which was the thing that you really needed to be able to read, and to do sums, to take care of your math. And, most Scots were not educated beyond that level, working class Scots. So, and it was, even in some of the caddies that Tommy associated with at the beginning were might not even have been that educated.
Right.
But Tommy was enormously well educated. And, therefore he developed a different view of himself. He wasn't interested in the slightest. First off, it's wise to keep in mind that everybody is really hard up for money and practically starving to death during the Victorian age. The food is scarce, money is scarcer. Any person who has earning ability has to put it to work for the family. And that's why kids got out of school at the age of 12. They could do something. They could collect seaweed and sell it. They could work as a caddy. They could put money in the family till, and everyone needed to do that. Tommy's brothers worked in his dad's shop. That put money in the till the way they could. But Tommy could make a lot of money playing golf, way more than he could make making clubs or balls.
Right.
So Tommy did what his family needed him to do, was go out and earn the most you could. And the way for him to do that was to be a golfer. And so he was the first professional golfer in that sense. He never caddied. I'm sure that it made him cringe when he saw his father stoop and tee up another man's ball. He was not about stuff like that. He had a different idea of his worth because of the schooling that his father insisted that he have. So then that his mother and father wanted him to become a man of a different kind. It was a huge expense for them to send him to that school compared to what they could have sent him to the Berg School for like a penny. And they spent, I think I estimated in the book 5% of their income just sending him to school, which was a big commitment. So it's obviously something that they were committed to. for their oldest living son.
Well, for those people listening who haven't read the book Monarch of the Green, I highly recommend it. It's if you've ever been to Scotland or if you want to go to Scotland, I consider it to be an absolute primer to read before you go. So let's move on to your new book, The Long Golden Afternoon. Admittedly, I haven't read it yet. I do have my copy.
Yay.
Handy. And this scene behind me is from the back cover of that. And I recognize that immediately as being Presswick, but you can see that the gentleman, is that Freddie Tate playing out
Yes,
of water?
Over your head, standing on the steps, is John Ball, and down in the bunker is Freddie Tate. Golfers of the modern age may be shocked to realize that you did not get relief from water, casual water, as we like to call it. That looks like rather formal water to me there, but you didn't get relief from that without penalty. So that is a painting that was done for me. I commissioned it because I originally was hoping that would be the cover of the book, but the publisher chose different images. But at least it's on the back there. But I had it painted by a wonderful, wonderful woman from England named Sandra Russell, who I just happened to see on social media. And there's an old picture of that scene, which is the 35th hole of the 1999 Amateur Championship Final at Prestwick between Freddie Tate and Johnny Ball. There's an old picture of it in a book that John Lowe wrote about Fred Tate called F.G. Tate, A Record. But it's so fuzzy that you could never use that image for a cover. But I thought if I got a watercolor painting of it, maybe that could be used on the cover. And it did get used on the cover in this way. So that's one of the great scenes in the whole book, one of the great matches in all of history. And that's why it's there.
Well, you made a comment earlier that Alan Robertson didn't play well, typically outside of St. Andrews on courses that weren't as well manicured, which I found to be amusing because in the photographs that I've seen of St. Andrews back when he would have been alive, there were no rakes and bunkers. There were, you were playing out of, hoof prints and boot prints.
The turf was quite nice at St. Andrews, and it wasn't always, it could be quite heavy in some other places, not as tight to the ground as it was at St. Andrews. So some places like North Berwick in the beginning, not now, of course, it's much more manicured, but in those days, the grass might be really thick and heavy in certain places because they didn't have mowers. You got to keep in mind that there was not a mower. It was
they had mowers, but they were on four legs.
Yes, in Allen's time in the early 1850s, that was a little bit before people started mowers were widely used. So there would be much rougher conditions anyway. So his game didn't travel as well as others did.
So how did this book come about? I mean, I imagine it came about as a result of you do the research on Monarch of the Green, and there's a body of research with interesting facts. Young Tommy would go down by train to play matches at Blackheath and other places. My recollection is he almost took a job there as a professional, if I'm not mistaken, or was offered that position.
He was, a lot of places would love to have had him, but what they really wanted for him to come down for a period of time and just play. Yeah. Tommy wasn't going to be doing like greenkeeping or anything like that, but
right.
He might make arrangements with you to come and play with your members for a month if you wanted to pay him enough. Yeah. Tommy had a lot of family ties down in England, particularly at Hoylake, because Hoylake was founded in 1869. The original designer of the golf course was George Morris, the one that Willie had beaten so badly, Tom's brother. George's son, Jack, became the first and a very long time professional at Royal Liverpool. So they had really close ties to the Morris family. Royal Liverpool was one of the early clubs to start staging big tournaments for professionals with big money attached to them. And Tommy would go and play in those. And during the course of the research for the Tommy book, I became aware of a tournament that, that's written about in the book that happened in 1872 at Hoylake, where Tommy plays and Davy Strath play and all the leading golfers play. Tommy wins. And one of the people following the match is a 10-year-old kid by the name of John Ball. And you see the thread continuing on.
Exactly.
18 years after that day, John Ball becomes the first Englishman and the first amateur to win the Open. But part of what happened as a research in the Tommy book, one of the things I was really trying to do with that was to put Tommy's accomplishments in the context of history. So it became necessary to continue researching forward, like what happened after Tommy. And the more I did that, the more I realized that it was a continuing story on multiple different levels. And that Tommy had played a pivotal role along with his dad in moving the game into England, and that was part of what continued it on to spread around the world. And, it dawned on me that at one point, the gutty ball gets introduced in 1848. For the 400 years that preceded that, golf was played in Scotland pretty much unchanged. There was, modest change, but extremely modest. Hardly any change in clubs, hardly any change in rules, hardly any change in approach or attire or anything. And then in a 50-year period, let's say 52 years, by 1900, Harry Vardon is touring America and the game is already worldwide.
Right.
So then I thought, that in and of itself is the sequel. How does the game go from the rise of young Tommy in the 1850s to a worldwide game in a period of 50 years? And there are not that many worldwide games. So I decided that I'm going to do another book about this, what happens after, when I was about halfway through the Tommy book. And so I kept on gathering material for book number 2, even as I was finishing up book number 1.
Well, there's some interesting connected dots going on here, in my mind anyway. When you think about it, Stuart Maiden emigrated from Carnoustie to Atlanta, where I live, and was the pro at Eastlake. So there's a Scottish connection to Bobby Jones. And then Harry Vardon tours the U.S. As a child, Francis meets him. I probably 10 years later, he beats him in the Open champion or in the U.S. Open. It's interesting, the legacy. It's like, I feel like it's Johnny Appleseed, these Scottish, and as it spread to England, and then from England it spread further. It's fascinating.
It is one of the opening sentence of chapter 2 of that book, The Long Golden Afternoon, is golf came to England the same way it would nearly everywhere else, through connections with the Scotsman. And that's more or less how it happened. Like Hoylake, for instance, was founded by a man named Glenmuir Dowie. His last name was Dowie. He's a Scotsman. He had a lot of English merchant friends. So it was Scotsmen primarily, or friends of Scotsmen. Royal North Devon, founded in 1864, which is the first truly English club, gets founded by Isaac Gossett, whose brother-in-law is Captain Moncrief of St. Andrews, and introduces the game of golf. And William Driscoll Gossett, who lived in Prestwick, met Old Tom and brought Old Tom down to lay out the golf course. So it all connects back to Scotsmen in the final analysis. And it's really a great Scottish diaspora that spreads the game around the world.
Exactly.
Carnoustie alone, Stuart Maiden, you mentioned, Carnoustie alone, 400 men from Carnoustie went to golf courses around the world to become professionals, 280 some of them to the United States alone. So it was that way that golf spread around the world, was Scotsmen took it there. Britain had a great empire, obviously. A lot of the major merchants were Scots. A lot of the leading military battalions were Scottish. The Black Watch that Freddie Tate belonged to. Those men, when they went to South Africa and they were stationed in South Africa for 6 months, the very first thing they did was find an open plot of land, dig some holes in it, and start playing golf on it. So the game spread around the world really as much as a result of a Scottish diaspora as any other thing.
Well, the same thing happened in Ireland. The Black Watch was in Southern Ireland, and I don't remember what course it is now. It's escaping me, but golf was planted there, at least at one popular course by the Black Watch. But it's fascinating to me how quickly it spread. I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, and I'm eager to dive into the book. But you're right, from the time of the feathery disappearing and the Haskell ball coming around in 1900, The world of golf had changed dramatically, and as you say, perhaps more so than it had in the previous 400 plus years, which is just staggering.
Yeah, it's like it's a change that's across the board. You got to keep in mind that this is, of course, is at the height of the Industrial Revolution when these things are happening, and
Right.
progress is happening on all fronts very, very rapidly in all sorts of technology. So the people who are running those companies, just as they do today, played golf. And all of them, en masse, people began applying their particular skill to the game of golf.
Right.
So agronomists, the making of seeds for grass, the building of golf clubs, the creating of golf balls, everything simultaneously begins to see massive improvement. And obviously, one of the big events is Englishmen fell in love with golf, and England started building golf courses at a rate of a golf course a week, literally, by the late 1890s. And there's another book out about this period by a good friend of mine named Michael Morrison, which documents in great detail how the golf courses of England multiplied and where and under what circumstances. It's not a storybook like the one that I wrote, but it's a great documented history book about the growth of golf clubs in England. And, Michael's demonstrated some pretty interesting things, like women's golf at some points in that period of the late 1890s, early 1900s was growing at a rate quite faster than men's golf. And so the English really took up golf enthusiastically, and partly because it was the Scottish national pastime. And the English liked nothing better than vanquishing a Scot at their own game. And that became their driving ambition, like right from the beginning. Yeah. The minute John Ball won in 1890, so many Englishmen took up the game with the idea of vanquishing the Scots. Even before John Ball won, there were Englishmen calling for a match between nations that, Scotland didn't have anybody that could match up against Horace Hutchinson or Johnny Ball. And of course, that didn't prove to be true, but that was a big motivating factor. And that's a big part of the story of the Long Golden Afternoon, is that intense rivalry between Scotland and England for supremacy at the game.
Yeah. Well, in the times I've been to Hoy Lake, you can't take a step without seeing John Ball's picture or clubs that he used, or but
I'm going to write a piece later this year for Through the Green, which is the magazine of the British Golf Collectors Society, making the argument that John Ball is the single greatest golfer that no one has ever heard of. And it's a shocking thing that he's so little known. John Ball is the winner of 9 major championships. 9. So
well, he won 8 British amateurs, right?
That's just an absurdity. One of them when he was 50. When Mickelson won his big thing and became the oldest championship golfer, it was John Ball that he passed. John Ball won the amateur when he was 50 years old for the 8th time. Yeah. To win the amateur, Bob Jones would tell you millions of times that the amateur is the hardest tournament to win. You have to win a series of singles matches, usually at least 6, sometimes as many as 7, depending on how large the field is, before you win a 36-hole match. And anybody that plays match play golf on the regular knows that you can be beaten by an inferior player. If they just get hot for 5 or 6 or 7 holes in a row, they can knock you off. Right. And not in a 36-hole match, which usually levels out the right way, but in an 18-hole match. And that's what makes it so hard to win and so remarkable that he won it that many times. He has 99 victories in the amateur championship.
Wow.
He came out in his later years to try to win one more match, entered again to try to win one more match to get the 100. And Darwin has such a romantic essay about the valiant effort. But then, the years caught up to him and he couldn't quite pull it off. But it was close.
Well, you did a lot of research on this book as well. And I have a similar question to what I asked about the other book. So you're doing all this research. Was there a time during your research where you uncovered something where you uttered to yourself, wow, I can't believe this. This is unbelievable.
It would be mostly about people that you think, oh my God, how can this person who has such a wonderfully dramatic, fabulous life be unknown? And similarly, how, when you think like now, if you think about the age of the long golden afternoon, I think most people would think of Harry Vardon first and foremost, because Vardon emerges as the second immortal after Tommy and the great player. But I was reading Harold Hilton's memoir, Reminiscences of Golf, and it was astonished to learn that when Vardon won his first Open, no fans followed, not one. He was playing with Hilton, and Hilton recalls somebody walked up to me and said, "Who's that you're playing with?" And he said, "Oh, Harry Vardon." The guy said, "Oh, never heard of him." And no one watched. So it wasn't like Vardon. Vardon was an unknown at the beginning, and it wasn't until his amazing streak of wins in 1898 and 1899 that he really was considered the top golfer in Britain. John Henry Taylor before him was the person everyone followed. And right. So it just, those kinds of things astonish you, because you realize, the truth is, I know the facts. I know that between them, Taylor, Vardon, and Braid won 16 Opens, but I don't know the story. And I think that people who read The Long Golden Afternoon, even people who are knowledgeable, will learn a lot of things that are fascinating about how the events unfolded and how surprising certain things were at the time that they occurred.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the characters. I have a collection of hickory clubs, and I know you must feel the same way when you pick up an old hickory and you're thinking, whose hands have been on this, right? Like how many great shots were hit with this? I can just imagine it being transported in horse-drawn carriage to a match, or some of this is before some of the clubs I have is before they had golf bags. But I got one that was made in 1908, and I know specifically it was made in 1908 by a gentleman named Ernest Jones. Have you heard of him?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
You're the only person I've ever met who's heard of him. So you've heard of his story and losing his leg in battle and coming out and shooting even par for the first 9 holes, standing on one leg, walking on crutches, and then, having moving to America and opening a shop where he can give lessons in the center of Manhattan, and giving more lessons than anyone. He's giving like 5,000 lessons a year. I mean,
yeah, he specialized in women too. He has a great instructional book that I read called Clubhead. Yeah. So I knew him mostly through the instructional book and the essay that Herbert Warren Wind wrote about him at the beginning of it. But that you're right. That's I play hickory golf. I play most of my rounds with hickory clubs now. And I started that just because I felt it was necessary to understand the age that I was writing about, to play with the clubs that were older, and to get a grasp of the degree of difficulty with those kinds of weapons. And I will say, in addition to that, the story that goes with the club, I have 2 made by Robert Simpson, the great club maker of Carnoustie, and a bunch of them by Tom Stewart from St. Andrews. But like when you hit a shot with a hickory brassy, let's say, when you hit a brassy from like 165 or 170 and it nestles up right against the flag, well, you feel like you're John Ball right there in that moment. And that's right. Something. So I don't know. I get more joy out of a great shot with a hickory club than I do with the modern club, for reasons that it's probably because I'm crazy. But anyway, I do find it to be that way.
Yeah. So why do you believe that understanding and sharing the history of golf is so important?
I love that question, Jeff. And here's the thing I would suggest to you. You're from the United States. You're a Braves fan, probably, as you live in Atlanta. There's all the Braves fan. They know about the history of their team. They know about the great Braves players of old. The Yankee fans all know about Ruth and Gehrig and their statistics and what they accomplished. And I have never quite understood why golf is not that way. Most golfers, even the great golfers I have known, people that devoted their whole lives to the game and became scratch players or plus players, don't know a thing about the history of their game. And I've always found that curious. And on one level, just a little depressing. So, when I was in newspapers, I developed a particular skill for telling a story that's true in a way that's easy to grasp and easy to understand and easy to read and more fun than what you would call a history text. And I felt like that was the thing that I could bring to the writing of golf history, was to take that skill that I developed over 34, 5 years of newspapering and apply it to telling true stories. And obviously there have been wonderful books written about the history of golf that are what you would call historic novels, where certain quotes and certain scenes are created by the author to establish the sort of drama that's necessary for that kind of tale.
Right.
And I guess the skill that I have is to create the same drama without having to invent anything, to simply find enough source material and have the experience and knack for telling it in a narrative way, in a way that still has quite a lot of drama, but doesn't require anything to be made up by me based on what I've learned. So I feel like that's important. I feel like it's important that golfers connect to their history. And I think there's just a lot of joy in understanding some of the amazing accomplishments that have occurred over the, I don't know, the first competition in golf ever is held in 1744 for the Silver Club that you can go see at Muirfield today. And in all the years between 1744 and now, there have been some pretty amazing golf played. And I just think there's joy in knowing about that. And I'm trying to spread that joy around among average golfers. No average golfer is going to read a serious history of the sort that you have to read to be able to write a book like this, because they tend to be, it's work to read those books. They're written to establish truths, not necessarily to tell a story. And brilliant as that is, they're hard to read. And I'm trying to create something that's easy to read, and that is based on intensive research.
Well, mission accomplished.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. It's it's been very fulfilling to me to see so many average Joe golfers finally grasp Tommy's life and importance, and in this book for people to start to understand about John Ball and Freddie Tate and James Braid, some of the performances that they put on. James Braid, between 1900 and 1910, which is a 10-year period, he wins 5 Open championships and 4 match play championships. So 9 major championships in 10 years, and dominates both forms of the game, both stroke play and match play, in a way that's very seldom been equaled over the years since then. And that's something I think golfers should know about. And I'm very happy to see that these.
And then he became a very sought after golf course architect.
Oh my gosh, yes, he was. I still think Braid's still one of my favorite golf architects. I don't think I've ever had any more fun than I did playing Brora, which is one of his brilliant creations.
That's just, I'll tell you what, we took a group this summer, and none of us had played Cullen, right? So we show up on a Sunday morning with a 9:20 tee time. They don't open till 10, so we can't get trolleys. So one of the guys decides, hey, I don't want to lug my bag with 14 clubs in it. Let's play a 7-club match, right? So we did. Stephen, I don't think I ever had more fun playing golf. That course is just fun. I mean,
oh my gosh, spectacularly fun. I mean, those C stacks. Here's the thing that I marvel at. Of course, they were always playing golf at Cullen, but they weren't using the C stacks as the hazards. They were just playing in their shadow principally. And then Tom got there and no. Here's what we want to do. These are the hazards. This is the natural feature of this landscape. And, we're going to play over them. We're going to play to them. We're going to play around them. And, that course is just an absolute joyride. And the vibe of the place is so cool too. You got the food truck next door. It seems like it's more of a surfer town. I loved Cullen, absolutely loved Cullen. I played it with Hickory clubs, with the proprietor of Jack White's shop in Gullen, Boris Litzo, played his hickories with me. just one of the great golfing days I've had, and one of the real highlights of my summer here on the Old Tom Morris Trail was Cullen.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Our guys loved it. We played another course that we hadn't played, and I can't believe I hadn't played it. Not too far from Murray, and that's Fort Rose and Rosemarkie, which was. Have you played that?
I have not. No,
Oh,
this summer I got to play all the courses on the trail. So I did the ones that are right there, Murray Old, like where you belong, and a few others. But no, I haven't gotten there. But my friend Jim Hartzell loves that course, and everyone I know that knows anything about Scottish golf loves that course.
it's fantastic. Well, I'm glad that you were able to play um, Murray, and Joe McClemon's a friend of mine, and I know he played with you and hosted you. We had him on the podcast not too long ago.
That's great. Joe is a wonderful man, and I loved Murray. I grew up in Annapolis, near Annapolis, and so Blue Angels were so much a part of my lifetime. Every spring, we would have a party in the backyard and wait for the Blue Angels to fly over. It was a big deal. My little brother graduated from the Naval Academy, so I'm very attached to that sort of thing. And so Joe and I and my friend Lee and another historian from the club there, John was his name, and I'm not going to remember his last name, sadly. Anyway, we were walking off the first tier, and we get like a flyover from the RAF base next door, and I just felt like a little burst of nostalgic joy there.
Yeah.
I thought Murray was a terrific golf course, and I love the clubhouse. The clubhouse is so beautifully sited. We stayed in town, and that night literally across the street from the golf club, and we had dinner there at the club. But the most fun was just to get a pint and sit out front of the clubhouse and watch the sun go down over the Covesea Lighthouse there. Murray Firth is very underestimated golfing territory all along, I thought. And that was one of my big surprises, was the beauty of the Murray Firth when I did the trail. I really fell in love with that area, and I would love to go back. And every course along it was wonderful. Nairn, Tane, Murray, Cullen, all of them. I just think if you're making a golf trip to Scotland, maybe you start in Dornoch and you just play your way down the Murray Firth all the way to Cruden Bay. That's a pretty spectacular trip, and the weather's really nice there compared to other places.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that so many of the people that want to go over want to play the big name courses. And we had I can tell you a quick story. We had two gentlemen over this past September, and it's the worst time to be in St. Andrews if you want to play the old course anyway, because the RNA autumn meeting.
Yeah.
And then you've got, at the end of the month, you've got the Dunhill Links Championship. So there was one day that they could apply for the ballot. We applied for them to get on the ballot. They couldn't get on. My partner got them on Panmure, right? So they go to Panmure. I text them, hey, did you enjoy Panmure? And they said, we're so grateful we didn't get on the old course, because we would have had to miss Panmure. It was the highlight of their trip. And it's for all those reasons that you talked about. It's not, there's the history there, but it's the friendliness of the club. They played at the end of the day. There was no one else there. They had a drink and saw the sunset. The whole thing.
I just think that people that go to Scotland trophy hunting are just making such a terrible mistake. And that was maybe my principal lesson from playing the Old Tom Morris Trail, to be honest, because it includes so many places that you wouldn't necessarily stop if you were out for top 100, like Tane, like Murray, like Dunbar, like Cullen, all these courses. Dunbar was one that just blew me away. You're just like, you walk through the wall there from the third tee to the fourth tee, and you just look around you and you're like, oh my God, this is got to be the most spectacular stretch of links land there is. And anyway, it's just, there's so many great experiences, and, the clubhouses at these places, that's just Scotsmen playing their game, loving their game on their home links. Yeah. And that's where the real fun of Scotland is in places like those, to my mind. I love those places.
Well, I appreciate the diversity of being able to go to Muirfield and wear a coat and tie and have a sit down lunch, and then the next day go to Dunbar where you could play in jeans and a t-shirt practically. I love that diversity in our game. I can't get enough of. But I'll tell you the other thing though, Stephen. There was a time. It's probably 20 years ago, maybe probably more than that. 25 years ago, no, 20 years ago. We went to a big name course, and it was me and my buddies. There's four of us, and we get out of our little rental van thinking we're going to have a great day. Right next to us pulls an enormous bus full of Americans, 50 plus people. Don't take this the wrong way. Fat, ugly Americans. They sound like they were from New Jersey. Not that that's a bad thing. What's it take to get a hot dog around here? Where's the cart barn? And you're like, we wanted to pack up and leave. Like, I don't want to play. I don't even want to be associated with people that think the game of golf is about cigars and hot dogs and riding a cart. And where's the cart girl? And I mean, it was just horrific.
Yeah, it's, my favorite thing about golf in Scotland is that it's game the way it was meant to be played. Everyone walks.
Yeah.
You can't use what they would call a buggy unless you have a note from your doctor that says you're too infirm to play golf the proper way, which is walking.
Right.
And
well,
so I love the fact that it's a walking game there.
Going to a place like Dunbar, you're not going to run into a busload of Americans. So
no, you're not.
I've got two last questions. One, do you have plans for more books on golf?
Yes. I am going to write another book about the early history of women's golf.
Okay.
And I feel like, I became incredibly fascinated with Joyce Weathered and began there. I think of Joyce Weathered as the greatest woman golfer of all time. And so the idea of this book would be that it would be built around the rivalry between her and Glenna Collette, which stretches out over a number of years. And in that way, you can tell the story of the growth of golf in the United States, women's golf, and the growth of women's golf in Britain, leading up to their big final match, which will be the centerpiece of the book. The way the story will be told will be around this match that occurs in St. Andrews in 1929 for the English Ladies Championship that comes down to a 36-hole final between Glenna and Joyce. And it becomes really a more poignant story from the British point of view, because at that time, Americans had already vanquished all the British male golfers. 1920, George Duncan, the Scotsman, wins the Open, the first one after the war. 1921, Jock Hutchinson wins. He's born in Scotland, but he claims American citizenship and brings the trophy back to America, which a very disconcerting event for his mates in St. Andrews, where he was born. And then, Hagen and Sarazen, and it's a long, long time. There's only one British win between 1923 and 1934. So at this time in 1929, there are no more Brits who are undefeatable by Americans except one, and that would be Joyce. Joyce had never lost to Glenna, and in the match, Glenna comes out firing. I mean, like seriously firing. And so much so that Darwin writes an essay about the mood at lunchtime that's called Ghastly, Horrible, but True. And but it's a very exciting match, and the end of it is different than the beginning, let's say. So that's where I'm going to go next.
Do you know who the first woman was that was hired as a golf professional in a club?
Meg Farquhar at Murray Old.
Man, you not only do you read a lot, you remember a lot. That's unbelievable.
Yes, no, actually, I'm part of what I'm doing with these essays is to write little nuggets of history about the course that are interesting or in some way, sometimes cultural things that got nothing to do with the golf course, sometimes things about the golf course that are unique. And one of the ones I'm looking at with the Murray Old story is Meg Farquhar, because not only did she get hired as the first woman golf professional, but she also competed from the same tees with men and comported herself quite well. And then, of course, when she went back to getting her amateur status and playing as an amateur, she was dominant amateur too in the whole north of Scotland there. So a person, once again, that not one single golfer in all the world, except for you as a member of Murray Old and a reader of history, have ever heard of, but I'm going to bring her name to light because that people should know about that. People
Well, you
should
and I
know.
are probably the only two Americans that know her name, but so I can't play Stump the Band with you, obviously.
It's a tough game to play with me, I'll tell you that, because I've number one, I have a photographic memory, and number two, I've read almost as many golf books as you. So it's a game I'm good at. Stump the historian.
So last question, when will the Duffers Literary Companion podcast be available, and how can people find you, and how can they buy your books?
Okay, let's start with the former. How can they, the latter, how can they buy my books? If you live in Britain, you can buy my book in a bookstore, and I hope you do that because I'm a big believer in bookstores. And one of the reasons I'm so proud to be published by Berlin Limited of Edinburgh is that Berlin is an independent publisher that supports bookstores. So if you could buy my book in a bookstore, I'd love for you to do that. If you live in the United States, that's not doable. So you need to buy it either from Barnes & Noble online, which is at least a bookstore. And maybe if enough people buy it online, they might be inspired to put it in the store. I doubt that. Or Amazon. Amazon sells it worldwide. And if you're in Europe or you're any place other than the United Kingdom, you don't really have a choice but Amazon to get the book. So that's where it is. You know, if you're not published by a major American publishing house, as Jim Hartzell would tell you as well, you cannot get your book in an American bookstore. Not that many Americans frequent bookstores anymore, the way that Britain still does, but I still would like to be in a bookstore, but I'm not in the United States. So as for the Duffers Literary Companion, that is a work in progress, and Jim and I, we're hoping to get it out before spring, let's say. We have a number of things to iron out, both in terms of our own execution of the podcast, as well as, you know, lining up a place for the podcast to appear so that we can, you know, not be shouting into the wilderness. So we're trying to stir up some excitement about it by letting people know that we're working on it. But it's still a work in progress. I'm hoping, you know, sometime before spring.
Excellent. I put myself on mute. Of course, now while you're talking, the lawn maintenance guy's here with his blower outside my office. But well, hopefully for all of our guests that go to St. Andrews, they'll stop into the local bookstore in St. Andrews. It'd be wonderful to see your book in the window. As a matter of fact, I did see Monarch of the Green. I lived in St. Andrews 18 months ago for the summer, and we would ramble through the two bookstores in town and just, you know, plop down for hours.
It was nice. They're both lovely bookstores, Toppings and Waterstones. And when I was in St. Andrews in June, as part of that old Tom Morris trail trip, both of the bookstores had a big display of books about golf in advance of the Open, and I was proud to see both of my books prominently displayed in their windows. And I stopped in at both places and signed all the books they had. So if they aren't already sold out, you can get a signed copy if you're in St. Andrews. And
well, I hope they're signed out. I hope they're sold out.
I do too. You know, obviously selling golf books is hard, so I'm always grateful for opportunities like this to speak about them. But, you know, I didn't do it to make money. I just did it, as I said, to spread the love of the game and its story. And I feel so happy that is happening, that, you know, more and more people are reading these books, and I think they're finding the kind of joy in it that I wanted them to find. And that makes me extremely happy and fulfilled.
Excellent. Well, Stephen, thank you. You've been very gracious with your time with us today. We really appreciate you being here. We're literally thrilled to have you on. And it's the first time I've seen your face. I'd recognize your voice anywhere from listening to you on other social media, or excuse me, not social media, but on other podcasts. So thank you so much for being with us.
Well, it was really fun, Jeff. Thanks a lot for having me, and I'm delighted to do it anytime you want.
Excellent. Thanks very much.